All right, welcome to my reading of the first chapter of Aravinda Diga's The White Tiger. These recordings, some of them were made in my classes and some of them I've patched in later on that I've done at home. So they are a bit of a mismatch, but hopefully you'll find that the really detailed reading and discussion of the novel really helps you to get a really deep understanding of it. You'll hear occasional mutterings from my class, but I've done my best to actually edit out the voices of students and what they had to say. So every now and again you'll hear a little bit of a jump, and that's the reason for that. All right, I hope you enjoy it. I am in the process of making other recordings, so look out for those if you find this useful. Cheers.
Now, what I normally start doing is I normally just start reading it and stopping and starting and talking as we go. And I suggest you have a highlighter pen as we're reading. And if we find something that sounds juicy, all right, highlight it. And then later on, when you've got time at home, type them in or write them into your quote bank. Note down the page that they're on, not because in high school you're ever going to write a page number in an essay, you don't. But later on you may want to find that quote again because you can't remember what on earth it was about. And so you've got to then go, oh, what was that quote about? I can't remember. So if you have the page number there, you can then just go straight to it and read the little bit above and the little bit below, and you remember what was going on when it was said. And it begins to make sense to you why you collected it in the first place. Does that make some sense? So it's about being organised. Then in another column, you might have something like, the background or the speaker. You might put a couple of notes in there. It might have been said by, say, VJ or the Stork, or somebody might have said it. And you might be able to tag it with a theme or meanings. I know that some people have got so organised as to be able to organise their quotes into themes using some kind of coding at the end. That's way beyond my abilities at this stage. But certainly, if you know why you're collecting the quote, why not write it down? If you know it's to do with corruption or, the squalor of village life or moral issues, Balram's character, something like that, you might want to start tagging them in that last column so that you can track things. All right. So we'll just start now looking at the first question, which is who is Balram writing to and why? Now, that's kind of given away by the second question, which is Google Premier Wen Jiabao. Now, I talked a bit about this in the class the other day. Wen Jiabao was Premier of China, or was at this time, and it asks you to Google him and find out who was he and what kind of leader was he regarded as having been. And what is it about the 21st century that Balram sees as connecting himself to Premier Jiabao? I'm suggesting that you spend maybe 3 or 4 or 5 minutes looking at this, but it is sometimes a good idea to actually not just be told stuff, but to look it up yourself. Now, when I did that, because I had no idea who Wen Jiabao was, I pretty quickly found that he was regarded as being a bit of a go-ahead, reforming Premier of China, somebody who was kind of bringing capitalism into China. So someone who was changing things a bit and innovative and all of those sorts of things. And I think, given that I'm giving away the answers a little bit there, that Balram kind of sees himself a little bit the same way. He says that somewhere in this first chapter, he says, I am tomorrow. So he kind of sees himself as being at the cutting edge of a new world, if you like. So question 3, where does Balram now live in India? The city, we're going to find that out pretty quickly. It's called Bangalore. What is the city well known for? Now, you'll need to Google the city to find out about that, but it'll take you about 2 seconds, because that's what I did. I'm like, Bangalore? I've never heard of Bangalore before, except maybe in a song, like children's song, maybe? I don't know. Anyway, I Googled it, and that's how I know about Bangalore. It took me about 2 minutes. Basically, it's the centre of the Indian technological economy. All of those call centre people that ring up that have Indian accents, many of them are in Bangalore. Plus, there's all the IT stuff there as well. So that's what you guys can work out from about 2 minutes of Googling. So then we get on to what is Balram's attitude to religion. It's not a religious book at all, but it is interesting to see religion coming and going in what he has to say. How does he compare gods to politicians? That's kind of important because, one of the major themes of the book is corruption, and politicians are corrupt. And I think he connects gods, the idea of gods, and the idea that gods are kind of, you'll see, we'll get there in a minute. He connects them to politicians in a really kind of clever way that might be worth saving for later use, really. So we might just start reading, and they're the first few questions, and we'll talk as we go. Grab a pen, a highlighter pen, and highlight stuff because it'll make it, and just do it, all of you have highlighters, because it will make it easier for you later on to just go back, spend an hour tonight going back and putting into a table these things that we highlight in the text and keeping up to date with that. And you will thank yourselves for it later on. You have this inner sense of glow of being super organised and on top of things if you do it. For the desk of His Excellency Wen Jiabao, the Premier's Office, Beijing, capital of the freedom-loving nation of China. Now, right away, 5th line down, I see freedom-loving nation of China. This is significant. And the only reason I know this is because I've read the whole novel, and this is my second time teaching it. Don't think that you were meant to know from the first 5th line it's significant, but I'm giving you a bit of a head start. It's significant. This main character, Balram, one of his greatest issues is freedom. He feels like his life, the life he was born into makes him a slave. And he's desperate to be a free man. And so this idea of freedom comes up all the time. From the desk of the White Tiger, a thinking man and an entrepreneur. This is his self-definition of who he is. Living in the world's centre of technology and outsourcing, Electronic City, Phase 1, just off Hosur Main Road, Bangalore, India. Mr. Premier, Sir, neither you nor I speak English, but there are some things that can be said only in English. Now, I don't think he can't speak English. I think he can speak English. I think he's kind of doing that thing of, we know we're really stupid, we can't speak English when people can. Do you know how people do that? I had a friend who was Thai who used to do that a lot. It'd be his kind of way, backhanded kind of way of saying you're all racist. He'd go, me no speak English, like that, as a way of saying everybody treats me like I can't speak English, but I can, kind of thing. I reckon that's what he's doing there. I could be wrong. But I do think he can speak English. My ex-employer, the late Mr. Ashok's wife, Pinky Madam. How many of you have read it so far? Are we reading for the first time? You've read it? No? First time for everybody? All right, so I'll point out some of the characters who are significant, and I'll tell you the ones that you can virtually ignore. Ashok is really important. He's the boss. He becomes Balram's employer. He's hugely significant. And Pinky Madam is his wife. She's also very significant as well. Okay. My ex-employer, the late, and notice late means he's dead. Okay, so we know immediately he's dead. The late Mr. Ashok's wife, Pinky Madam, taught me one of these things. And at 11:32 p.m. today, which was about 10 minutes ago, when the lady on All India Radio announced Premier Jiabao is coming to Bangalore next week, I said that thing at once. We don't know what that thing he says in English is, but it can only be said in English, all right? We're going to find out. He's going to hold us in suspense for a little while and then tell us, and you're going to enjoy it when he does. If you haven't read this, it's quite funny, especially when the teacher reads it out. In fact, each time when great men like you visit our country, I say it. Not that I have anything against great men. In my way, sir, I consider myself one of your kind. You might even highlight the one of your kind. He thinks he's a great man, this fellow. But whenever I see our Prime Minister and his distinguished sidekicks, what does that phrase, distinguished sidekicks, remind you of? It's mocking, isn't it? It's mocking. And it's almost like I get that feeling already of there's sarcasm there, but also this idea of a bit of corruption or cronyism. That's a good word, cronyism. You know, cronyism, I don't even know how to spell it. I'd have to look it up. It's like when councils go really corrupt and they're all kind of, giving out contracts to each other and kind of, it's all a bit, you rub my back, I'll rub your back. It's that kind of idea that everybody's a bit kind of corrupt and looking after each other in that kind of way. So, but whenever I see our Prime Minister and his distinguished sidekicks drive to the airport in black cars, get out and do namastes. Now, namastes is this. It's that. Namastes, like that. Yeah. Whenever he sees them doing namastes before you in front of a TV camera and tell you about how moral and saintly India is, I have to say that thing in English. We don't know what that thing is yet, but it's coming. So he says, whenever he hears India described as a moral and saintly place, he says it, whatever it is. Now, you are visiting us this week, Your Excellency, aren't you? All India Radio is usually reliable in these matters. Okay, more sarcasm. That was a joke, sir. Huh. That's why I want to ask you directly if you really are coming to Bangalore, because if you are, I have something important to tell you. See, the lady on the radio said Mr. Jabal is on a mission. He wants to know the truth about Bangalore. And I've highlighted that because this novel, divided into 8 letters, is Balram's attempt to provide his version of the truth about what India is and what Bangalore is as well, I suppose. My blood froze. If anyone knows the truth about Bangalore, it's me. I highlighted that as well. If anyone knows the truth, it's me. Next, the lady announcer said, Mr. Jabal wants to meet some Indian entrepreneurs and hear the story of their success from their own lips. She explained a little. Apparently, sir, you Chinese are far ahead of us in every respect, except that you don't have entrepreneurs. And our nation, though it has no drinking water, electricity, sewage system, public transportation, sense of hygiene, discipline, courtesy, or punctuality, does have entrepreneurs. All right, so he's telling us that India doesn't have any of these basic things. Doesn't have sewage. It has sewage, doesn't have sewerage, which is the system to dispose of it in a sanitary way. But it's got entrepreneurs, it's got people running around all over the place making a buck, climbing all over each other making a buck. All right, thousands and thousands of them, especially in the field of technology. And these entrepreneurs, we entrepreneurs, have set up all of these outsourcing companies that virtually run America now. That's a nice little globalisation connection. But that quote about, it really, for you guys, it connects up really well with global politics. You might want to collect that sarcastic critique of what India is. It's a country that has none of these basic necessities, but it does have a thriving entrepreneurial economy. And Balram's kind of looking down his nose at that and saying, well, is this something really to be admired? You hope to learn how to make a few Chinese entrepreneurs. That's why you're visiting. That made me feel good. But then it hit me that in keeping with international protocol, the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of my country will meet you at the airport with garlands, small take-home sandalwood statues of Gandhi, and a booklet full of information about India's past, present and future. Now, garlands are kind of flower arrangements, aren't they? And sandalwood is, but it's kind of exotic to Asia. You sort of get it in Thailand and stuff like that as well. Now, Gandhi, who knows who Gandhi is? Very, very, very the centre of the liberation of India from hundreds of years of British colonial rule. I think it was about 1949, around then. There's a great film about Gandhi, which you may just be relaxing one weekend and wish to watch. It's fantastic. Ben Kingsley plays Gandhi in it. He's awesome. But Gandhi's also renowned not just for liberating India, but because he took a policy of non-violence in that. And so he's kind of seen a bit like people like Nelson Mandela, and that he's seen as a visionary and some, almost the kind of spiritual person. So I'm just saying that we should collect that quote with the garlands and that sandalwood statues and the statues of Gandhi and the information, because it's sort of this image of India and Balram's, one of the things he does in this first chapter is he provides a contrast between what the image of India is and what he sees as the reality of India. And it's this image of an exotic, go-ahead place with an incredible exotic history and culture, versus this kind of squalid reality. Squalid means dirty and poor and that sort of thing. So the image versus the reality, and this whole chapter is about seeing the idea of trying to get at a truth that is being kind of covered up or obscured by politicians' presentation of an image of India as being an exotic place and so forth. So when he thinks about these politicians turning up with all of this paraphernalia to show India off, that's when I had to say that thing in English, sir, out loud. That was at 11:37 p.m. 5 minutes ago. I don't just swear and curse. I'm a man of action and change. I decided right there and then to start dictating a letter to you. To begin with, let me tell you of my great admiration for the ancient nation of China. I read about your history in a book, Exciting Tales of the Exotic East, which I found on the pavement back in the days when I was trying to get some enlightenment by going through the Sunday second-hand book market in Old Delhi. This book was mostly about pirates and gold in Hong Kong, but it did have some useful background information too. It said that you Chinese are great lovers of freedom and individual liberty. So you might highlight great lovers of freedom and individual liberty, because part of this connection he has to this Wen Jiabao is this idea that there is that love of, I don't know how true it is, but again, it's more emphasis of that being so important to him. The British tried to make you their servants, but you never let them do it. I admire that, Mr. Premier. I'm no expert in Chinese history. I thought the British had a pretty good stranglehold over China, but the Chinese certainly did mount rebellions the whole time against British attempts to control them. I was a servant once, you see. Only 3 nations have never let themselves be ruled by foreigners: China, Afghanistan and Abyssinia. These are the only 3 nations I admire. Out of respect for the love of liberty shown by the Chinese people, and also in the belief that the future of the world lies with the yellow man and the brown man, now that our erstwhile master, the white-skinned man, has wasted himself through buggery, mobile phone usage and drug abuse, I offer to tell you free of charge the truth about Bangalore. All right, so here we get more of that love of liberty. We get a connection to the idea of the yellow man and the brown man, and by that he means people of Asian, South Asian background. So the brown man would be people from Pakistan and India and that part of Asia, I would imagine, maybe the Middle East even. And by yellow man he means the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans and so forth. He obviously expresses some fairly negative opinions about what he sees as Western decadence, and he includes in that drug use, mobile phone usage, quite comically, but also buggery, which means that he's anti-gay, and he sees that as being a sign of Western decadence, I suppose. I've just got to take on board what he says and move on. But he's offering to tell you free of charge the truth about Bangalore by telling you my life story. So he sees his own life story as embodying, in a way. Embodying means to kind of take on as representing. He himself is almost the truth of Bangalore, what Bangalore is really about, if we know who he really is. See, when you come to Bangalore and stop at a traffic light, some boy will run up to your car and knock on your window while holding up a bootlegged copy of an American business book, wrapped carefully in cellophane and with a title like 10 Secrets of Business Success, or Become an Entrepreneur in 7 Easy Days. Don't waste your money on those American books. They're so yesterday. I am tomorrow. Highlighted, I am tomorrow. But who is I? Who's Balram? When he says I am tomorrow, what does he mean? Let's wait and see, we'll find out. In terms of formal education, I may be somewhat lacking. I never finished school, to put it bluntly. Who cares? I haven't read many books, but I've read all the ones that count. I know by heart the works of the 4 greatest poets of all time: Rumi, Iqbal, Mirza, Ghalib, and a 4th fellow whose name I forget. I am a self-taught entrepreneur. I just highlight self-taught entrepreneur. That's the best kind there is, trust me. When you have heard the story of how I got to Bangalore and became one of its most successful, though probably least known businessmen, you will know everything there is to know about how entrepreneurship is born, nurtured and developed in this, the glorious 21st century of man. The century, more specifically, of the yellow and brown man. Now that's that paragraph. I have the whole of that paragraph highlighted and the next sentence as well. Have you guys heard of the Asian century? Have you heard of that? Heard that term, the Asian century? I first heard it around 2000, and the idea was that the way that the global economy and population centres and so forth is changing, that prior to in the 20th century and probably the 19th century, the kind of the centre of what's driving the world forward was in Europe and America, North America, and mainly white people were doing it, the white economies there. But that with the growth of China, Japan, India, Korea, and the sheer numbers of people involved and the technological advancements and so forth, they talk about this century, the 21st century, as becoming the Asian century, where those economies will potentially take over and start to drive the world rather than the older economies in Europe and North America. So he's talking about this century, specifically the century of the yellow and brown man. But backtracking into that paragraph, he says, when you've heard the story of how I got to Bangalore and became one of its most successful businessmen, so when we know how he got there, you will know everything there is to know about how entrepreneurship is born, nurtured and developed in this, the glorious 21st century of man. He's going to tell us a nasty story about how he's got there. And so we're going to come out of this knowing that Indian entrepreneurship comes about in a grubby, horrible way. This is not a good story. Yeah? That's what he's getting at there. So the 20th century, more specifically of the yellow and brown man, you and me. It's a little before midnight now, Mr. Jabal. A good time for me to talk. I stay up the whole night, Your Excellency, and there's no one else in this 150 square foot office of mine, just me and a chandelier above me, although the chandelier has a personality all of its own. It's a huge thing, full of small diamond-shaped glass pieces, just like the ones they used to show in films in the 1970s. Though it's cool enough at night in Bangalore, I put in a midget fan, 5 cobwebby blades, right above the chandelier. See, when it turns, the small blades chop up the chandelier's light and fling it across the room, just like the strobe light at the best discos in Bangalore. Do you guys know what a chandelier is? Yeah? It's sort of, what do you associate with chandeliers? Wealth, yes. Fancy wealth? Almost a bit kind of snobbiness? Unnecessary, yeah, good. So it's you don't have a chandelier in an office. This is crazy. It's about wealth. It's opulence. It's over the top. It's a display of something. It's also a light, and we'll get on to light and dark. The idea of light and dark are important ideas that run through this as well. So this is also a light. And it's a symbol, but I must admit I struggle with understanding the symbol through the whole novel. Maybe you'll do better than I do. So this is the only 150 square foot space in Bangalore with its own chandelier, but it's still a hole in the wall, and I sit here the whole night. The entrepreneur's curse. He has to watch his business all the time. Otherwise, somebody or something might happen to it. Now, I'm going to turn the midget fan on so that the chandelier's light spins around the room. I am relaxed, sir, as I hope you are. Let us begin. Before we do that, sir, the phrase in English that I learned from my ex-employer, the late Mr. Ashok's ex-wife, Pinky Madam, is, What a fucking joke. So if we now backtrack, that was a quote, by the way, so I'm allowed to say it. If we backtrack now, we can see that in all of those moments where he's hearing about India being held up as this really exotic, lovely place, and how Wen Jiabao is going to come and talk to all the politicians about getting some more entrepreneurship into China, that Balram really just wants to say, what a fucking joke. That's what he wants to say about that. And that's a quote. So I reckon all of us now have one quote for their essays. Is that right? You remember that one? Cool. All right, good. It is definitely a quote. And he made a big deal out of it. All right, so there's a little asterisk moving us along to a slightly different section. Now I no longer watch Hindi films on principle. Hindi is the main language in India. The main religion in India is Hindu. That can be a little bit confusing because they're similar words. So India has a number of different languages. Hindi is probably the main one though. Hindi, most films would have Hindi as the spoken language. Now I no longer watch Hindi films on principle. But back in the days when I used to, just before the movie got started, either the number 786 would flash against the black screen. The Muslims think this is a magic number that represents their god. Or else you would see a picture of a woman in a white sari with gold sovereigns dripping down to her feet, which is the goddess Lakshmi of the Hindus. Sorry for the pronunciation of these words. It is an ancient and venerated custom of people in my country to start a story by praying to a higher power. I guess, Your Excellency, that I too should start off by kissing some god's ass. This is his attitude to religion here, that you kiss some god's ass. So he's not very religious, or not very respectful of religion. Which god's ass, though? There are so many choices. See, the Muslims have one god. The Christians have 3 gods. I think that's Father, Son and the Holy Ghost, he means. And we Hindus have 36 million gods, making a grand total of 36 million and 4 divine asses for me to choose from. Now, there are some, and I don't just mean communists like you, because remember, China's a communist country, but thinking men of all political parties who think that not many of the gods actually exist. Some believe that none of them exist. There's just us and an ocean of darkness around us. I'm no philosopher or poet. How would I know the truth? It's true that all these gods seem to do awfully little work, much like our politicians, and yet keep winning re-election to their golden thrones in heaven year after year. I've kept that as well, because that's the idea, he's really, this word is cynical. He's really cynical but he's cynical about politicians, the idea that they don't achieve anything and yet keep getting re-elected. He's cynical about the idea of God, that God doesn't intervene and improve anything, and yet people spend so much time worshipping God. And that's not to say that I don't respect them, Mr. Premier. Don't you ever let that blasphemous idea into your yellow skull. My country is the kind where it pays to play it both ways. The Indian entrepreneur has to be straight and crooked, mocking and believing, sly and sincere at the same time. What's he saying there? What do you think he's saying there? You've got to hedge your bets a little bit. You heard of hedging your bets? You have a bet each way and just try to pay both sides. The novel has a lot of dualisms, two things together. So the idea of a lot of contrast through duality. So I'm not explaining that very well, so I'll just go on. Hopefully I'll explain it better next time. So I'm closing my eyes, folding my hands in a reverent namaste, and praying to the gods to shine light on my dark story. Bear with me, Mr. Jiabao. This could take a while. How quickly do you think you could kiss 36 million and 4 asses? So he's done that. He's said a little prayer in his own head or whatever he says. Done. My eyes are open again. 11:52 p.m. and it really is time to start. A statutory warning, as they say on cigarette packs before we begin. One day as I was driving my ex-employers, Mr. Ashok and Pinky Madam, in their Honda City car, Mr. Ashok put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Pull over to the side." Following his command, he leaned forward so close that I could smell his aftershave. It was a delicious fruit-like smell that day, and said politely as ever, "Balram, I have a few questions to ask you, all right?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Balram," Mr. Ashok asked, How many planets are there in the sky? I gave the answer as best I could. Balram, who was the first Prime Minister of India? And then, Balram, what is the difference between a Hindu and a Muslim? And then, what is the name of our continent? Mr. Ashok leaned back and asked Pinky Madam, did you hear his answers? Was he joking? She asked, and my heart beat faster as it did every time she said something. No, that's really what he thinks the correct answers are. She giggled when she heard this, but his face, which I saw reflected in my rear view mirror, was serious. The thing is, he probably has, 2-3 years of schooling in him? He can read and write, but he doesn't get what he's read. He's half-baked. The country is full of people like him, I'll tell you that. And we entrust our glorious parliamentary democracy, he pointed at me, to characters like these. That's the whole tragedy of this country. He sighed. All right, Balram, start the car again. What do we make of that conversation? Is he mocking him? Let's separate it out into two bits. Separate for a second. How does Balram likely to feel hearing this? Separate that from what Ashok and Pinky Madam are doing in the back seat of the car. They're laughing at him. Are they thinking about how he feels? What might that tell us about how they think about Balram? Yeah, he's lesser than them. They have no guilt about speaking about him like that, no appreciation that he might have feelings. They feel quite free in the back seat of the car to say these things which are really demeaning and horrible. And that says a lot about how they think about the world, but it also says a lot about their relationship between Balram and these two people in the back seat, that he doesn't matter at all to them. Now we can look at Balram's feelings. How does Balram feel about what he's heard? Yeah, basically, he doesn't like hearing that said about him. But he goes on to say that it's true in a way. That night I was lying in bed inside my mosquito net, thinking about his words. He was right, sir. I didn't like the way he had spoken about me, but he was right. The autobiography of a half-baked Indian. That's what I ought to call my life story. And I'm collecting all this half-baked stuff too, because they're nice, juicy quotes, and they're not hard to remember. The idea that you can be half-baked, and it's because you don't have an education and so forth. And he's going to go on and explain what he means by half-baked now. Me and thousands of others in this country like me are half-baked because we were never allowed to complete our schooling. Open our skulls, look in with a penlight, and you'll find an odd museum of ideas, sentences of history or mathematics remembered from school textbooks. No boy remembers his schooling like one who was taken out of school, let me assure you. That's an amazing phrase, I think, because it's true. It's, if you denied an education, that's when a lot of people anyway, will do anything to learn something new. So in his head, we're still looking inside his skull, sentences about politics read in a newspaper while waiting for somebody to come to an office, triangles and pyramids seen on the torn pages of the old geometry textbooks which every tea shop in this country uses to wrap its snacks in, bits of All India radio news bulletins, things that drop into your mind like lizards from the ceiling in the half hour before falling asleep. All these ideas half-formed and half-digested and half-correct mix up with other half-cooked ideas in your head. And I guess these half-formed ideas bugger one another and make more half-formed ideas, and this is what you act on and live with. The story of my upbringing is the story of how a half-baked fellow is produced. So he's saying he's ignorant and that many other people are ignorant, that they're doing their best with really incomplete understanding of things, that they just are picking up bits and pieces from everywhere. And they don't really understand the world they're living in. But pay attention, Mr. Premier, fully formed fellows, after 12 years of school and 3 years of university, wear nice suits, join companies and take orders from other men for the rest of their lives. entrepreneurs are made from half-baked clay. What's he saying there, do you think? What's he saying about fully formed fellows? Who are they, first of all? Like us, we're the fully formed fellows. You guys, what does he think of the fully formed fellows? Necessarily a pathway to freedom either, that you can find yourself just caught up in a machine. But let's face it, we are all fully formed fellows because, life is better. My life is better because I have a job and an education and so forth. But I still do follow orders every day of my life as well. Entrepreneurs, though, to be an entrepreneur, you need to think outside the box and sometimes to break rules or do things differently in order to get ahead. And I think what he's saying is that sometimes coming from a background that's a bit chaotic can actually help you to do things in a different way and not sort of just fit into the mould. So entrepreneurs are made from half-baked clay. To give you the basic facts about me, origin, height, weight, known sexual deviations. To give you the basic facts about me, origin, height, weight, known sexual deviations, etc. There's no beating that poster, the one the police made of me. And I like the way this is just starting. We're just being drip-fed information here about this guy. All right, so now we're hearing about a police poster. Calling myself Bangalore's least known success story isn't entirely true, I confess. About 3 years ago, when I became briefly a person of national importance owing to an active entrepreneurship, a poster with my face on it found its way to every post office, railway station and police station in this country. Now, his active entrepreneurship, you should highlight that because he's going to explain what he means by his active entrepreneurship. Hey? Exactly. He's going to cast his decision to murder his employer and steal his money as an active entrepreneurship. Okay? And it's also interesting to see it's 3 years since that happened. We get that from this little bit here. A lot of people saw my face and name back then. I don't have the original paper copy, but I've downloaded an image to my silver Macintosh laptop. I bought it online from a store in Singapore, and it really works like a dream. And if you'll wait a second, I'll open my laptop, pull that scanned poster up and read from it directly. But a word about the original poster. I found it in a train station in Hyderabad, in a period where I was travelling with no luggage, except for one very heavy red bag. The red bag. Full of money. Yeah. So he's making his way on the train carrying a red bag. And coming down from Delhi to Bangalore, I had the original right here in this office. This is the original poster he's talking about, in the drawer of this desk for a full year. One day the cleaning boy was going through my stuff and he almost found the poster. I'm not a sentimental man, Mr. Jabal. Entrepreneurs can't afford to be. So I threw the thing out, but before that I got someone to teach me scanning. And you know how we Indians just take to technology like ducks to water. It took just an hour or 2 hours. I am a man of action, sir. And here it is on the screen in front of me. I'm not a sentimental man. Entrepreneurs can't afford to be. That's kind of important because his active entrepreneurship of killing his boss has major repercussions for him. Now, there were repercussions for his family from what he's done. So if he was sentimental, he wouldn't have been able to do it because of what he had to actually be willingly prepared to let happen if he was very sentimental. So that's you can say, I'm not a sentimental man, entrepreneurs can't afford to be. Could be a good quote. And I also like the talk about technology. How long does it take to scan something? About 10 seconds. So I think he's kind of having a bit of a dig at himself and his technological skills there. He's self-depreciating, I think you call it. Self-deprecation, yeah. Okay, so here's part of the poster. Assistance sought in search for missing man. General public is hereby informed that the man in the picture, namely Balram Halwai, alias Munna, son of Vikram Halwai, rickshaw puller, is wanted for questioning. Age between 25 and 35. Complexion, blackish. Face, oval. Height, 5 feet 4 inches, estimated. Build, thin, small. What do you get from the description? Could be anyone. Yeah? What else stands out there as unusual? The author, his father and mother were a doctor and a banker, but what about his age? What does the age, they've got his name, they know who his dad is, hey?
There's a 10-year gap in age, who they were.
Yeah, great. So if you know somebody's age and who their parents are, why can't you know how old they are without knowing that they're between 25 and 35? It says that there's no detailed records. That things are different. This is a very different place. There's probably no birth certificate for him. Well, that's not exactly right anymore, sir. The blackish face bit is still true, although I've half a mind to try one of those skin whitener creams they've launched these days so Indian men can look white as Westerners. But the rest, alas, is completely useless. Life in Bangalore is good. Rich food, beer, nightclubs. So what can I say? Thin and small? Ha! I am in better shape these days. Fat and pot-bellied would be more accurate now. But let us go on. We don't have all night. I'd better explain this bit right now. Balram Halwai alias Munna. See, my first day at school, the teacher made all the boys line up and come to his desk so he could put our names down in his register. When I told him what my name was, he gaped at me. Munna? That's not a real name. He was right. It just means boy. That's all I've got, sir, I said. It was true. I'd never been given a name. Didn't your mother name you? She's very ill, sir. She lies in bed and spews blood. She's got no time to name me. And your father? He's a rickshaw puller, sir. He's got no time to name me. Don't you have a granny, aunts, uncles? They've got no time either. The teacher turned aside and spat. A jet of red pan splashed the ground of the classroom. He licked his lips. Could you imagine me doing that? Imagine if your teacher's like spitting on the floor. And this pan, they chew this stuff and it makes their mouths all red. But they want to spit it out as well. I don't know what they call it pan, but I've seen it beetle nut or something. They
Like a cup.
Well, you couldn't you? You could spit it into a cup or something. Yeah. All right, well, I promise I'm not going to spit on the floor for you. So the teacher says, well, it's up to me then, isn't it? He passed his hand through his hair and he said, we'll call you Ram. Wait, don't we have a Ram in this class? I don't want any confusion. It'll be Balram. You know who Balram was, don't you? No, sir. He was the sidekick of the god Krishna. Know what my name is? No, sir. He laughed. Krishna. I came home that day and told my father that the school teacher had given me a new name. He shrugged. If that's what he wants, then we'll call you that then. So I was Balram from then on. Later on, of course, I picked up a third name, but we'll get to that. Now, what kind of place is it where people forget to name their children? Now, I reckon the people in India, no matter how poor they are, name their kids. I really do. I think, I can't believe that this is actually real. And I've got a video clip I'm going to show you, a video thing, I hope to show you, about people who live in this part of India where there is a rural school, and it's awful actually. Some of you may not even want to watch it, or I might have to be a bit careful about it because there's actually an accident that happens and the children are poisoned and many of them die, and it's an accidental poisoning. But the grief and the grief of the families at losing their children is very, very, very real. And I think one of the criticisms of this book is actually, I mean, Adiga is a wealthy guy. He's not from these poor classes, and his characterisation of Indian family life is very much that it is without love. And I think we need to be careful that we don't think that that is actually how India is. But I think we do need to be really careful to realise that it's a novel, and the novel's written by a guy who doesn't come from this background. and it has been criticised by Indian people who've said, I'm sorry, but this is just not how Indian family life is at all. And when you see the video, you will see people, and I think there's one woman who's lost two of her children, and we're poor. The only thing we have is our children. That's all we have that gives us any joy and love in our lives, and to lose them is just the worst thing that could happen to us. So we can use it. This is how he's representing his life. In the next section of the story, he actually describes his mother's funeral, and it's quite awful, actually. So if there's anyone here who's had a recent kind of death or lost a parent or anything like that, and I don't know about it, let me know now. And you might, I don't know if you want to even just be ready for it, speak up. When I read it, it made me kind of a bit upset, actually, when I read it the first time. Anyway, it may not make anybody upset, but I'll get on to it. Here, before we get there, we've got a bit of stuff on other stuff. So the suspect comes from the village of Laxmanga. Can you see that spelling of Laxmanga there, all of you? Now, you're all going to be able to spell that in your essays. For some reason, I just get this warm inner glow when I see it spelled correctly in student essays. It just makes me think, that student can spell that word correctly. And it's hard to spell. Conversely, the opposite impression is conveyed if you can't spell it. So it's really not a hard thing. It just, it's all about creating impressions with the examiner. And if you are creating an impression of knowing your stuff, that's one way to do it that's actually not that hard. It's lax, man, gar, lax, man, gar. So he comes from the village of Laxmanga like all good Bangalore stories, mine begins far away from Bangalore. You see, I am in the light now, but I was born and raised in the darkness. So these ideas of the light and the darkness, mine begins far away from Bangalore. You see, I'm in the light now, and I was born and raised in the darkness. Even a phrase like born and raised in the darkness could be a quote. Now, he's going to go on and explain what he means by the darkness. But this is not a time of day I talk about Premier. So he doesn't mean darkness and light as in day and night. It means something else. I am talking of a place in India, at least a third of the country, a fertile place full of rice fields and wheat fields and ponds in the middle of those fields, choked with lotuses and water lilies and water buffaloes wading through the ponds and chewing on the lotuses and the lilies. Those who live in this place call it the darkness. Please understand, Your Excellency, that India is two countries in one, an India of light and an India of darkness. The ocean brings light to my country. Every place on the map of India near the ocean is well off, but the river brings darkness to India, the Black River. You have to kind of visualise India. He's saying that the darkness is the interior of India. It's this dry, well, not so dry because we've got that big river running through it. It's the rural interior of India that he's calling the darkness. And in many ways, it should be a good place. It's fertile. It has fertile soil. Crops grow really well there. It has that amazing river running through it. Have you heard of the Ganges River? Yeah?
The one that comes from
the mountains? Yeah. I think it does, actually. Yeah. It ends up in Bangladesh. It starts up north, and yeah, it comes down and it finishes up down on that delta down at Bangladesh. I don't know my geography that well, but it's like one of the four most famous rivers in the world. You think Amazon, Nile, Mississippi maybe, and the Ganges River. Like, it's massive. Next class I do a little thing on the Ganges for you to just kind of visualise it. It's normally, he's calling it the Black River, and he's saying that the river brings darkness to India. But the river, wherever the river is kind of bad and rural and backward and all that sort of stuff. Which Black River am I talking of? Which river of death, whose banks are full of rich, dark, sticky mud, whose grip traps everything that is planted in it, suffocating and choking and stunting it? This is all highlightable stuff, this Ganges River stuff. He's calling it the river of death. He's saying it traps everything that's planted in it, suffocating and choking and stunting. Stunting means making something so it's unable to grow or prosper or thrive. Why, I am talking of Mother Ganga, daughter of the Vedas, river of illumination, protector of us all, breaker of the chain of birth and rebirth. Everywhere this river flows, that area is the darkness. This river is hugely significant to India and to the Hindu religion and to death rituals and so forth. It's normally regarded as being a holy river and having major religious significance. So his decision to describe it in this way, in this very negative way, is really counter the normal way that it's portrayed. He's portraying it as a negative, death-like place that's trapping everybody. It's usually portrayed as this holy place that people make pilgrimages to, and very beautiful. So, one fact about India is that you can take almost anything you hear about the country from the Prime Minister and turn it upside down, and then you will have the truth about that thing. So this is part of his truth, and his mission is that everything you're told is the opposite of the truth. And the river is part of that. So that's all quotable. So anything you've told, turn it upside down. Now, you have heard of the Ganga. You've heard the Ganga called the river of emancipation. Do you know what emancipation is? We talked about slavery in America, and we talked about the emancipation of the slaves. It's freedom. So it's normally called the River of Freedom, and hundreds of American tourists come every year to take photographs of naked sadhus at Hardwar or Benares, and our Prime Minister will no doubt describe it that way to you and urge you to take a dip in it. No, Mr. Jabal, I urge you not to dip in the Ganga unless you want your mouth full of feces, straw, soggy parts of human bodies, buffalo carrion, and seven different kinds of industrial acids. All right. He's describing this river as filthy, polluted, disgusting, dangerous. I know all about the Ganga, sir. And here comes his personal story. When I was 6 or 7 or 8 years old, no one in my village knows his exact age, I went to the holiest spot on the banks of the Ganga, the city of Benares. I remember going down the steps of a downhill road in the holy city of Benares, at the rear of a funeral procession, carrying my mother's body to the Ganga. Kusum, my granny, was leading the procession. Sly old Kusum. Highlight sly old Kusum. Kusum is another super important character in this novel. She's super, super, super important. Now, she's his granny. She had this habit of rubbing her forearms hard when she felt happy, as if they were a piece of ginger she was grating to release grins from. This image of her. Sorry, Alex, you won't get to see this. Her teeth were all gone, but this only made her grin more cunning. All right, so getting this image of her, no teeth, cunning. She had grinned her way into control of the house. Every son and daughter-in-law lived in fear of her. All right, these are all quotable quotes. Yeah? There's Kusum, her first introduction. So she controls everything and people are afraid of her. And even though she smiles, it's not very nice. She reminds me of Gollum from Kusum. Okay, so my father and Kishan. So just to confuse you, Kishan is another important character. Kishan is Balram's brother. So really, we've just got his mum's dead. She doesn't reappear. His father. We've got Ashok and his wife Pinky Madam. Now we've got grandma and we've got brother Kishan. And Kishan's also important because through the whole novel, Kishan for Balram is what Balram's afraid he's going to end up as. So he always looks at what's happening to Kishan and how his life's washing up, and he's thinking, that's my destiny too. Kishan doesn't have that edge to him that Balram does to get out. He just lets it all happen. So my father and Kishan, my brother, stood behind her to bear the front end of the cane bed which bore the corpse. My uncles, who are Munu, Jairam, Diviram and Umesh, stood behind holding up the other end. You don't need to worry about them, they don't reappear, those names. My mother's body had been wrapped from head to toe in a saffron silk cloth, which was covered in rose petals and jasmine garlands. I don't think she had ever had such a fine thing to wear in her life. Her death was so grand that I knew all at once that her life must have been miserable. My family was guilty about something. Could end up using that, I don't know how, but you never know. My aunts, and again there's a list of names that we don't need to worry about remembering, Rabri, Shalini, Malini, Lutu, Jaydevi and Ruchi, kept turning around and clapping their hands for me to catch up to them. I remember swinging my hands and singing, Shiva's name is the truth. Shiva's the god, the main god. We walked past temple after temple, praying to God after God, and then went into a single file between a red temple devoted to Hanuman and an open gymnasium where 3 bodybuilders heaved rusted weights over their heads. I smelled the river before I saw it. A stench of decaying flesh rising from my right. I sang louder, the only truth. Then there was a gigantic noise, firewood being split. A wooden platform had been built by the edge of the Ghat, just above the water. Logs were piled up on the platform, and men with axes were smashing the logs. Chunks of wood were being built into funeral pyres on the steps of the Ghat that went down into the water. 4 bodies were burning on the Ghat steps when we got there. We waited our turn. Now, it's customary to cremate people on the banks of the river, and that's these Ghats are like, I think they're stone. I'll get some video of this up on the next lesson. But yeah, they take the bodies to the river and burn them on the edges, and then what's left of them ends up in the water. In the distance, an island of white sand glistened in the sunlight, and boats full of people were heading to that island. I wondered if my mother's soul had flown there to that shining place in the river. I have mentioned that my mother's body was wrapped in a satin cloth. This cloth was now pulled over her face, and logs of wood, as many as we could pay for, were piled on top of the body. Then the priest set my mother on fire. She was a good, quiet girl the day she came to our home, Kusum said, as she put her hand on my face. I was not the one who wanted any fighting. I shook her hand off my face. I watched my mother. As the fire ate away the satin, a pale foot jerked out like a living thing. The toes, which were melting in the heat, began to curl up, offering resistance to what was being done to them. Kusum shoved the foot into the fire, but it would not burn. My heart began to race. My mother wasn't going to let them destroy her. Under the platform, with the piled-up logs, there was a giant, oozing mound of black mud where the river washed into the shore. The mound was littered with ribbons of jasmine, rose petals, bits of satin, charred bodies. A pale-skinned dog was crawling and sniffing through the petals and satin and charred bones. I looked at the ooze, and I looked at my mother's flexed foot, and I understood. This mud was holding her back, this big, swelling mound of black ooze. She was trying to fight the black mud. Her toes were flexed and resisting, but the mud was sucking her in, sucking her in. It was so thick, and more of it was being created every moment as the river washed into the Ghat. Soon she would become part of the black mound, and the pale-skinned dog would start licking her. And then I understood. This was the real god of Benares, this black mud of the Ganga into which everything died and decomposed and was reborn from and died into again. The same would happen to me when I died, and they brought me here. Nothing would get liberated here. I stopped breathing. This was the first time in my life I fainted. I haven't been back to see the Ganga again since then. I'm leaving that river for the American tourists. Very disturbing imagery. What does he mean by the trapping? The idea of being trapped. I think, and I'm not sure I've quite got my head around this, I think it is partly to do with the idea of just being trapped in where you're born into, that you're born into something in life, and that you're never going to get away from it. And if you come from that rural part of India, you're never going to get away. It's just going to keep sucking you back in all the time. I think that's what he's getting at there, but it's a little bit confusing and quite disturbing. I think he sees both his parents as people who never got out. His father ends up dying as well. Sorry to break all the news to you, but people around him are not getting out of this. They're trapped. They're being sucked into this darkness, and the darkness comes from the river, the black mud of the river, and it just keeps sucking people back in unless they're able to resist it.
All right, just continuing here without a class on my own with my greyhound and cats, and the sound of hammering from the house being built across the road. So he comes from the village of Laxmanga in the district of Gaya. This is a famous district, world famous. Your nation's history has been shaped by my district, Mr. Jabal. Surely you've heard of the Bod Gaya. I have to apologise for my pronunciation here and showing my ignorance. The town where the Lord Buddha sat under a tree and found his... Can you hear that? I think it's an angle grinder. Where the Lord Buddha sat under a tree and found his enlightenment and started Buddhism, which then spread to the whole world, including China. And where is it? But right here in my home district, just a few miles from Laxmanga. I wonder if the Buddha walked through Laxmanga. Some people said he did. My own feeling is that he ran through it as fast as he could and got to the other side and never looked back. What now? What do we mean by he ran through it as fast as he could? Well, what we mean, what I think he's getting at is that he's telling us it's an awful place. So he ran through it and he never looked back. There is a small branch of the Ganga that flows just outside Laxmanga. Boats come down from the world outside bringing supplies every Monday. There's one street in the village. A bright strip of sewage splits it in two. On either side of the ooze, a market. 3 more or less identical shops selling more or less identically adulterated and stale items of rice. See that? Adulterated and stale. Use of language there to create an impression of it being not very nice. Cooking oil, kerosene, biscuits, cigarettes and jaggery. At the end of the market is a tall, whitewashed cone-like tower with black entwining snakes painted on all its sides, the temple. Inside you'll find an image of a saffron-coloured creature, half man, half monkey. This is Hanuman, everyone's favourite god in the darkness. Do you know about Hanuman, sir? He was the faithful servant of God Rama. And we worship him in our temples because he is a shining example of how to serve your masters. Here we go. A shining example of how to serve your masters with absolute fidelity, love and devotion. Fidelity means loyalty. Love and devotion are pretty straightforward. These are the kinds of gods they have foisted on us, Mr. Jabal. So there's a couple of words there. Foisted means something's forced upon you. And also there's a they. There's this idea that the people in the darkness are having something pushed upon them. They're powerless. Understand now how hard it is for a man to win his freedom in India. Right? They're not free because even their gods are servants. So how hard it is for a man to win his freedom in India. So much for the place. Now for the people. Your Excellency, I am proud to inform you that Laxmanga is your typical Indian village paradise. Adequately supplied with electricity, running water and working telephones, and the children in my village raised on a nutritious diet of meat, eggs, vegetables and lentils will be found when examined with tape measure and scales to match up to the minimum height and weight standards set by the United Nations and other organisations whose treaties our Prime Minister has signed and whose forums he so regularly and pompously attends. Now, I've highlighted the whole thing. Obviously, you're not going to have a quote as long as that in your essay, but it's all sarcasm, and you can kind of break it down. You have your typical Indian village paradise, the idea of it being supplied with all of these things, and the children are being healthy and looked after and well fed, and that the government is monitoring them with tape measures and scales, checking up that they fit what they're telling the rest of the world that they're doing, And this idea of treaties, because you sign a treaty, don't you? You make an obligation. So the Prime Minister signed off that all of this is going to be done, and actually, you know what, the records probably show it is being done, but this is all a part of that idea of India, you know, of the entrenched corruption in India, and that in fact a lot of this stuff, this image, is not really what's going on underneath the surface. So here he portrays what the image is, and now he goes on to the reality. Electricity poles, defunct. Defunct is broken. Water tap, broken. Children, too lean and short for their age, with oversized heads from which vivid eyes shine like the guilty conscience of the government of India. All right, that's a great quote there. The children with vivid eyes shining like the guilty conscience of the government of India, who has said in these, by signing these treaties and what it's reporting to the world, it's helping village children, and it isn't. Yes, a typical Indian village paradise, Mr. Jabal. Hello, come and sit on my lap, you stupid cat. All right. One day I'll have to come to China and see if your village paradises are any better. Down the middle of the main road, families of hogs are pigs, are sniffing through sewage. The upper body of each animal is dry with long hairs that are matted together into spines. So hogs sniffing through sewage down the middle of the main road. The upper body of each animal is dry with long hairs that are matted together into spines. The lower half of the body is peat black and glistening from sewage. Now, you're not going to quote all this. I know you're not going to quote it all, but he's using this imagery to create these two different images of one of this disgusting, vile India versus the image that's presented by the politicians. Vivid red and brown flashes of feather roosters flying up and down from the roofs of houses. Past the hogs and roosters, you'll get to my house, if it still exists. Now, in class when I did this, I asked my students, what does he mean by that, if it still exists? This is part of that drip feeding. Right, his family, as we find out later on, have probably all been murdered as a consequence of what Balram ends up doing. So he's drip feeding his audience with these clues to that. It will be revealed later on. So perhaps his house isn't there anymore. At the doorway to my house, you'll see the most important member of my family, the water buffalo. I love water buffaloes, personally. They are the most beautiful looking animals. She was the fattest thing in our family. This was true in every house in the village. All day long the women fed her and fed her fresh grass. Feeding her was the main thing in their lives. All their hopes were concentrated in her fatness, sir. If she gave enough milk, the women could sell some of it, and there might be a little more money at the end of the day. She was a fat, glossy-skinned creature with a vein the size of a boy's penis sticking out of her hairy snout, and a long, thick, pearly spittle suspended from the edge of her mouth. She sat all day in her own stupendous crap. She was the dictator of our house. Now, I happen to love water buffaloes, so I'm quite aware of the way in which the author, Adiga, or Balram, the narrator, has chosen to particular language that describes the water buffalo in repulsive negative terms. The vein the size of a boy's penis, for example, and sitting in its own feces. In fact, they do quite like to sit in mud. They're renowned for that, but yes, it's quite a revolting image. Also, the women are being portrayed in a very, very, very negative fashion. Once you walk into the house, you will see if any of them are still living after what I did. More drip feeding, if any of them are still living after what I did. The women working in the courtyard, my aunts and cousins, and Kusum, my granny, one of them preparing the meal for the buffalo, one winnowing rice, one squatting down looking through the scalp of another woman, squeezing the ticks to death between her fingers. Every now and then they stop their work because it is time to fight. All right, these, again, the images of the way that the women are behaving are purposefully very negative. I mean, the picking of ticks or lice from hair is something that poor people need to do who don't have effective treatment for those sorts of things, but the fact that he's put that in, it helps to construct them as seemingly repulsive. And then they go on to their behaviour, which is every now and again they stop their work because it is time to fight. It's like there's this routinised fighting that goes on. This means throwing metal vessels at one another, at pulling each other's hair, then making up by putting kisses on their palms and pressing them to each other's cheeks. At night they sleep together, their legs falling one over the other like one creature, a millipede. So they're dehumanised in this description. They're not showing love to anyone in the family. Their only care is for this repulsive animal, the fat water buffalo. They are revolting in the way that they behave towards each other, and they're dehumanised through likening them to a millipede. And one does need to wonder whether Balram, who is responsible probably for all of their deaths, is in a sense rationalising what he did to his audience, whoever his audience really is. I don't believe it's truly the Premier of China. I don't believe he ever truly intends to send these letters, but is he trying to rationalise what he did and justify it by making the people who are the ultimate victims of it seem more repulsive and expendable? Or is that truly how he feels about them? Has he come out of this experience just feeling nothing at all for them, and he's actually literally expressing his repulsion for them all and disdain for them? Men and boys sleep in another corner of the house. Early morning, the roosters are going mad through the village. A hand stirs me awake. I shake my brother Kishan's legs off my tummy, move my cousin Papu's palm out of my hair, and extricate myself from the sleepers. So this image also is confronting. It's this idea of all these people sleeping on top of each other. And this is not something most people who get to read books like The White Tiger and do Year 12 at school ever have to experience. But even so, the way in which the males are described is different. Kishan's legs are on his tummy and he has to move Papu's palm out of his hair. So it's not as negative as the way that the women are portrayed, which I find interesting. I think the portrayal of women in this novel is quite horrible, which is not necessarily a criticism of the author. The character, in the same way that he makes many comments that are, quite homophobic. He also makes many comments about women that are quite repulsive, but is this perhaps not just a realistic portrayal of what many people are like? I'm going to keep going with my reading now. Come, Mana, my father calling me from the door of the house. I run behind him. We go out of the house and untie the water buffalo from her post. We are taking her for a morning bath all the way to the black pond beneath the Black Fort. The Black Fort stands on the crest of a hill overlooking the village. People who have been to other countries have told me that this fort is as beautiful as anything seen in Europe. The Turks or the Afghans or the English or whichever foreigners were then ruling India must have built the fort centuries ago. So the Black Fort, it's beautiful, it's compared to Europe, and it's built by foreigners in the past. For this land, India has never been free. First the Muslims, then the British bossed us around. In 1947, the British left. There you go, I got that wrong. I said 49, that was Indonesia. 47, the British left. But only a moron would think that we became free then. I like that. Good quote. Only a moron is somebody who's really stupid. Only someone who was stupid would think that the British leaving India was when they became free. Remember, the British were there. They were the colonial powers. The world was carved up in previous centuries between the Europeans, the various European countries who, they controlled all sorts of parts of the world in Asia, Africa, and so forth, and exploited the people and their resources, their natural resources, in order to make Europe wealthy. Now, you wonder why Europe is so wealthy. Well, it's because they were able to suck all the wealth out of most of the rest of the world. India was one of the places that the British had a very strong foothold. Here in Australia, we should be quite aware that Australia is another place that they had a very strong foothold and in fact took Australia from the original owners of this continent, the indigenous nations that were here. New Zealand also, Canada I think too, originally America even, from the First Nations people there. All right, I'm going to keep going. Now the foreigners have long abandoned the Black Fort and a tribe of monkeys occupy it. All right. No one else goes up except for a goat herd taking his flock to graze up there. Now this fort is symbolic, and it's a bit elusive what it's symbolic of, but I think the idea that the foreigners have abandoned it is significant. So if you think about it as being the sort of structures of power, the pinnacle of society, the heights of society where people have greater understanding, greater wealth, greater perspective, all of that sort of thing. Foreigners got in there and they had all of that, then they've left and are now a tribe of monkeys occupied. I would argue that he's describing those at the top of Indian politics as a tribe of monkeys. They're ridiculous and so forth. And no one else goes up. So they're left alone at the top. At sunrise, the pond around the base of the fort glows. Boulders from the walls of the fort have rolled down the hill and tumbled into the pond, where they lie moist and half submerged in the muddy water, like the snoozing hippopotamuses that I would see many years later at the National Zoo in New Delhi. Lotuses and lilies float all over the pond. The water sparkles like silver, and the water buffalo wades, chewing on the leaves of the lilies and setting off ripples that spread in a big V from her snout. The sun rises over the buffalo and over my father and over me and over my world. So I think this, and I've been trying for years to get my head around what all this means, but I've just had a connection between the way he describes this scene and the way that he describes the darkness in general when he begins to describe it. He portrays the potential for beauty there, talking about the water lilies and, that sort of thing. So I think what he's saying is that there is a potential for beauty there. So at sunrise, so like at the beginning of the day, you can just glimpse this potential for beauty. But then the sun comes up and the reality is shown, and it's seeing the buffalo and his poor father and him and his world in this village. I think that's what he's getting at. I'm still, each year I teach this, I'm struggling a little bit more with these symbols. Now back to the poster. The suspect was last seen. I think I can go to my other recording now, so I'm just going to pause for a second.
We've just talked about the Black Fort, or last time we did. The Black Fort, Balram talks about his dad taking him out there. He says it's on a hill overlooking the village. It's been built by people from overseas, foreigners, and remember how India's been colonised by various people, but they've now gone. And this fort is symbolic in the book. He keeps going back to it. In this particular moment, he talks about how the various. I think it's kind of a symbol in some ways of what the West has. The beauty that Westerners sort of enjoy in their lives and some of the privileges that Westerners have. Maybe that's what it is. I'm not really sure. But he says on page 22, now the foreigners have long abandoned the Black Fort and a tribe of monkeys occupy it. I wondered, could this tribe of monkeys be also a little bit symbolic maybe of the politicians that have sort of filled that vacuum at the top of society and are basically not very civilised in the way that they're doing things. And then he says, no one else goes up except for a goat herd taking his flock to graze there. And I see this fort as being kind of when you get to the top of the fort, you kind of have this vision of the world and an understanding, but you have to have the guts to go up there and actually take your place up there. And he does talk about, in that little section there, he does talk about this. He says, the sun rises over the buffalo, over my father, and over me, and over my world. So his world is at the bottom of the fort. The fort is up on the hill. It's out of reach, And actually, in subsequent times where he talks about the fort, he tells us that he's afraid of it. And it's only when he overcomes that fear that he's able to make some changes in his life. So he goes on then to talk, going back to the poster that he's salvaged from a railway station. The suspect was last seen wearing blue checkered polyester shirt, orange polyester trousers, maroon coloured sandals. Maroon coloured sandals? Ugh! Only a policeman would have made up a detail like that, and I flatly deny it. Blue checkered polyester shirt, orange polyester trousers. Ah, well, I'd like to deny those too, but unfortunately they're correct. Those are the kinds of clothes, sir, that would appeal to a servant's eye. And I was still a servant on the morning of the day this poster was made. By the evening I was free and wearing different clothes. Now there is one phrase in this poster that does annoy me. Let me go back to it for a moment and fix it. Son of Vikram Halwai, rickshaw puller. Mr. Vikram Halwai, rickshaw puller, thank you. My father was a poor man, but he was a man of honour and courage. I wouldn't be here under this chandelier if not for his guidance. So Vikram, his dad, is an important character. So we could highlight the fact that he's a man of honour and courage there. And also just remember the fact that Balram has a bit of anger towards the fact that his father's not treated with respect, which is kind of captured by his wanting him to have Mr. there. In the afternoons, I went from my school. Yeah, highlighter pens are good. And then all you need to do later on is just go back to what you've highlighted and transfer it into your journal, whatever you've got. And hopefully you can remember what I've said and what other people have said. If anyone ever gets a word in, apart from me, that is, of course. Hopefully they will. That's a joke. All right. Okay. In the afternoons, I went from my school to the tea shop to see him. This tea shop was the central point in our village. The bus from Gaia stopped there at noon every day, never late by more than an hour or two. And the policemen would park their jeep here when they came to bugger somebody in the village. This is his word he likes to use frequently, bugger somebody in the village. The police are corrupt. They mess people up in lots and lots and lots of ways. They're out for themselves. So if you wanted to later on talk about corruption, Balram describes the police coming to bugger up somebody in the village. That's again a quote that you could be used. You could end up, and because corruption is such a big theme in this book, you often end up in your essays with a whole paragraph on it, sometimes a whole essay on it. So you want to kind of start to collect all of this evidence so that you've got layers of things to discuss in your essay. So police coming to bugger somebody in the village. A little before sunset, a man circled around the tea shop 3 times, ringing his bell loudly. A stiff cardboard-backed poster for a pornographic film was tied to the back of his cycle. What traditional Indian village is complete without its blue movie theatre, sir? A cinema across the river showed such films every night, 2.5-hour fantasias with names like He Was a True Man, or We Opened Her Diary, or The Uncle Did It, featuring golden-haired women from America or lonely ladies from Hong Kong, or, so I'm guessing, Mr. Premier, since it's not like I've ever joined the other young men and went to see one of these films. Again, he's making fun. Of course he's been in to see these films. He's poking fun at himself again. The rickshaw pullers parked their vehicles in a line outside the tea shop, waiting for the bus to disgorge its passengers. They were not allowed to sit on the plastic chairs put out for the customers. They had to crouch near the back in that hunched-over squatting posture common to servants in every part of India. So that's that idea of servants being kind of downtrodden and treated like animals. They don't get a chair. So you could collect that hunched-over squatting posture that's common to servants. That could be a quote. So these people who are crouching down, they're the rickshaw pullers, yeah? So they're not allowed to have a chair in the tea shop, and they adopt this crouching thing, almost squatting around. My father never crouched. I remember that. He preferred to stand, no matter how long he had to wait and how uncomfortable it got for him. I would find him shirtless, usually alone, drinking tea and thinking. So Vikram is also a thinker. Then there would be the honk of a car. The pigs and stray dogs near the tea shop would scatter, and the smell of dust and sand and pig shit would blow into the shop. A white ambassador car had stopped outside. My father put down his teacup and went out. The door of the ambassador opened. A man got out with a notebook. The regular customers of the tea shop could go on eating, but my father and the others gathered in a line. The man with the notebook was not the buffalo, he was the assistant. There was another fellow inside the ambassador, a stout one with a bald, brown, dimpled head, a serene expression on his face, and a shotgun on his lap. He was the buffalo, all right? So we're going to pay attention to these animals and the fact that there's a shotgun sitting on his lap. He's in a fancy car, got a shotgun. The buffalo was one of the landlords in Laxmanga. Can any of you spell Laxmanga yet? Yeah, you can. Very good. Laxmangar. Yeah? Laxmangar. Okay. He's one of the landlords in Laxmanga. There were 3 others, and each got his name from the peculiarities of appetite that had been detected in him. The stork was a fat man with a fat moustache, thick and curved and pointy at the tips. He owned the river that flowed outside the village, and he took a cut of every catch of fish caught by every fisherman in the river, and a toll from every boatman who crossed the river to come to our village. His brother was called the Wild Boar. This fellow owned all the good agricultural land around Laxmanga. If you wanted to work on those lands, you had to bow down to his feet and touch the dust under his slippers and agree to swallow his day wages. When he passed by women, his car would stop. The windows would roll down to reveal his grin. 2 of his teeth on either side of his nose were long and curved like little tusks. The raven owned the worst land, which was the dry, rocky hillside around the fort, and took a cut from the goat herds who went up there to graze with their flocks. If they didn't have their money, he liked to dip his beak into their backsides, so they called him the raven. What does that refer to, do you think? Come on, somebody be brave. Yeah, what does the raven do if people can't pay? Dip his beak into their backsides. Okay, the beak is the penis, and the backside is just the backside. So if he can't get these boys to pay, he will rape them, basically. These nasty creature, the raven. And this phrase, dip his beak, that is Balram's word for sex, which appears frequently in this book. All right, so the buffalo, this is the guy in the car with the shotgun, was the greediest of the lot. He had eaten up the rickshaws and the roads. So if you ran a rickshaw or used the road, you had to pay him his feed, 1/3 of whatever you earned, no less. All 4 of the animals lived in high-walled mansions just outside Laxmanga, the landlord's quarters. They had their own temples inside the mansions and their own wells and ponds, and did not need to come into the village except to feed. So you can use this idea of these 4 animals, these landlords, they're feeding on the village. They've got it locked up where they own everything. Nobody can get anywhere because they're controlling everything. They live outside the village and they come in to kind of feed on the people in the village. Once upon a time, the children of the 4 animals, so use that phrase, the 4 animals. Once upon a time, the children of the 4 animals went around town in their own cars. Kusum remembered those days. But after the buffalo's son had been kidnapped by the Naxals, perhaps you've heard about them, Mr. Jabal, since they're communists, just like you, and go around shooting rich people on principle, the 4 animals had sent their sons and daughters away to Dhanbad, or to Delhi. The Naxals are like terrorists, and they are real, like in India. You can just Google, one of the questions somewhere in here is Google Naxal terrorists. And they are like communists, I suppose, but they run around the Indian countryside basically killing rich people. And so the landlords are terrified of them, and because in the past they've actually attacked their children. So they're another sort of thing that's going on in the book. The Naxals. I like that name, Naxals. Their children were gone, but the animals stayed and fed on the village. There you go, fed on the village. Perfect quote there. And everything that grew in it. Fed on the village and everything that grew in it. Perfect quote. Until there was nothing left for anyone else to feed on. And that's perfect. So the rest of us in the village left Laxmanga for food. Each year, all the men in the village waited in a big group outside the tea shop. When the buses came, they got on, packing the inside, hanging from the railings, climbing onto the roofs, and went to Gaia. There they went to the station and rushed into the trains, packing the inside, hanging from the ceilings, climbing onto the roofs, and went to Delhi, Calcutta and Dhanbad to find work. So we saw a bit of that in that clip the other day about people leaving the countryside to go to the city looking for work. Yep. And they're men, so they're moving away from their families. A month before the rains, the men came back from Dhanbad and Delhi and Calcutta, leaner, darker, angrier, but with money in their pockets. The women were waiting for them. They hid behind the door, and as soon as the men walked in, they pounced like wildcats on a slab of flesh. There was fighting and wailing and shrieking. My uncles would resist and managed to keep some of their money, but my father got peeled and skinned every time. I survived the city, but I couldn't survive the women in my home, he would say, sunk into a corner of the room. The women would feed him after they fed the buffalo. Pretty nasty depiction of family life, isn't it? Indian family life. We really shouldn't swallow all of this and believe that this is how family life is. This is this author's depiction of it. Remember, he grew up in a nice middle-class home with mum and dad, a banker and a doctor. So he's talking about people. He's not part of this life, really. So there's been a lot of Indian people who've been quite critical of this depiction of family life. So just be aware of it. It's Balram's story, but be aware, just in terms of our own development as human beings, that people in India aren't necessarily like this. But you can use all of that stuff. You can use Balram's description of just how squalid and awful the family life is. You can use all of that. I would come to him and play around with him by climbing his back and passing my palm over his forehead, over his eyes, over his nose, and down his neck to the little depression at the pit of his neck. I would let my finger linger there. It is still my favourite part of the human body, so a really rare moment of tenderness there involving his dad. A rich man's body is like a premium cotton pillow, white and soft and blank. Ours are different. My father's spine was a knotted rope, the kind that women use in villages to pull water from wells. The clavicle curved around his neck in high relief like a dog's collar. Cuts and nicks and scars like little whip marks in his flesh ran down his chest and waist, reaching down below his hip bones into his buttocks. The story of a poor man's life is written on his body in a sharp pen. Perfect quote. Grab that one. Vikram, the story of a poor man's life is written on his body in a sharp pen. My uncles also did back-breaking work. Even something like back-breaking work you can keep. But they did what everyone else did. Every year, as soon as it began raining, they would go out into the fields with blackened sickles, begging one landlord or the other for some work. Then they cast seed, cut weeds, and harvested corn and paddy. My father could have worked with them. He could have worked with the landlord's mud, but he chose not to. He chose to fight it. So now, since I doubt that you have rickshaw pullers in China or in any other civilised nation on earth, you will have to see one for yourself. Rickshaws are not allowed inside the posh parts of Delhi, where foreigners might see them and gape. Insist on going to Old Delhi or Nizamuddin. There you'll see the road full of them, thin, stick-like men, leaning forward from a seat of a bicycle as they pedal along a carriage bearing a pyramid of middle-class flesh. Some fat man and his fat wife and all their shopping bags and groceries. It's just quotes galore there, really, isn't there? And when you see these stick men, think of my father. You could use that stick man, the stick man of India. Rickshaw puller he may have been, a human beast of burden, but my father was a man with a plan. Human beast of burden is a good quote too. And also, His father was a man with a plan. I was his plan. One day he lost his temper at home and began yelling at the women. This was the day they told him that I had not been going to class. He did something he had never dared to do before. He yelled at Kusum. How many times have I told you, Munna must read and write? Kusum was startled, but only for a moment. She yelled back, this fellow came running back from school. Don't blame me. He's a coward and he eats too much. Put him to work in the tea shop and let him make some money. My aunts and cousin sisters gathered around her. I crawled behind my father's back as they told him the story of my cowardice. Now you may find it incredible that a boy in a village would be frightened of a lizard. Rats, snakes, monkeys and mongooses don't bother me at all. On the contrary, I love animals. But lizards, each time I see one, no matter how tiny, it's as if I turn into a girl. My blood freezes. There was a giant cupboard in my classroom whose door was always slightly ajar. No one knew what it was there for. One morning the door creaked open and a lizard jumped out. It was light green in colour, like a half-ripe guava. Its tongue flicked in and out of its mouth. It was at least 2 feet long. The other boys barely noticed until someone saw my face. They gathered in a circle around me. 2 of them pinned my hands behind my back and held my head still. Someone caught the thing in his hands and began walking towards me with slow, exaggerated steps. Making no noise, only flicking its red tongue in and out of its mouth, the lizard came closer and closer to my face. The laughter grew louder. I couldn't make a noise. The teacher was snoring at his desk behind me. You could even keep teacher snoring at his desk. Like it's a symbol of just how messed up everything is. Imagine if I was snoring at my desk right now. The lizard's face came right up to my face and then it opened its light green mouth and then I fainted for the second time in my life. Remember the first time was when he saw his mother. My father did not laugh. I had not gone back to school since that day. My father did not laugh and when he heard the story. He took a deep breath. I felt his chest expanding against me. You let Kishan drop out of school, but I told you this fellow had to stay at school. His mother told me he'd be the one who'd made it through school. His mother said, to hell with his mother, Kusum shouted. She was a crazy one and she's dead and thank goodness. Now listen to me. Let the boy go to the tea shop like Kishan. That's what I say. Remember Kishan's his brother? Yep. The next day my father came with me to my school for the first and last time. It was dawn, the place was empty. We pushed the door open. A dim blue light filled the classroom. Now our school teacher was a big pan and spit man. Remember I talked about pan? It's the red stuff. Did I talk about that in the last class? You chew it? I think it could be called beetle nut. You might see it if you travel in Asia. It's quite popular. I think people get a bit of a buzz out of it actually. You might get a little bit of a high from it maybe. But your mouth goes all red and people like to get rid of the spit. So teacher just sits there spitting on the floor in the classroom. Bit nicer here at school, isn't it? All right, yeah, he was a bit of a pan and spit man, and his expectorate, that's what he spits out, made a sort of low red wallpaper on 3 walls around us. When he went to sleep, which he usually did by noon, we stole pan from his pockets, distributed it amongst ourselves and chewed on it, and then imitating his spitting style, hands on hips, back slightly, arch slightly, took turns spitting at the 3 dirty walls. A faded mural of the Lord Buddha, surrounded by deer and squirrels, decorated the 4th wall. It was the only wall that the teacher spared. The giant lizard, the colour of a half-ripe guava, was sitting in front of this wall, pretending to be one of the animals at the feet of Lord Buddha. It turned its head to us. I saw its eyes shine. Is this the monster? The lizard turned its head this way and that, looking for an exit. Then it began banging the wall. It was no different from me. It was terrified. Don't kill it, Daddy. Just throw it out the window, please. The teacher was lying in one corner of the room, reeking of booze, snoring soundly. Near him was the pot of toddy he had emptied the previous night. My father picked it up. Toddy is alcohol. The lizard ran, and he ran behind it, swinging the pot of toddy at it. "Don't kill it, Daddy, please." But he wouldn't listen. He kicked the cupboard, and the lizard darted out, and he chased it again, smashing everything in his way and yelling, "Yeah, yeah!" He pounded it with the pot of toddy until the pot broke. He smashed its neck with his fist. He stamped on its head. The air became acrid, a stench of crushed flesh. He picked the dead lizard up and flung it out the door. My father sat panting against the mural of the Lord Buddha surrounded by the gentle animals. When he caught his breath, he said, "My whole life I have been treated like a donkey. All I want is that one son of mine, at least one, should live like a man." Really kind of important idea that, the idea that his dad feels so strongly, that explosion of anger at this lizard which is standing in the way of Balram getting his education, and that idea that he wants him to live like a man. What it meant to live like a man was a mystery. I thought it meant being like VJ, the bus conductor. This is another important character, VJ. Right? He's a bus conductor when we first meet him here. The bus stopped for half an hour at Laxmanga, and the passengers got off, and the conductor got down to have a cup of tea.
And I'm just going to butt in on my own commentary and just add that I think that Balram portraying himself as a child, as having that empathy and compassion for the lizard that frightens him. He begs his father not to kill it, but his father, shows him the way, really, that he is going to have to take drastic and very violent action in order to get anywhere in life. And remember earlier that Balram has also said that, it was his father's guidance. He needed his father's guidance in order to get him out of where he was. And I think that partly his father's guidance is that idea of living as a man, but also that sometimes you need to be tough. So I'll just go back to my classroom recording now.
Bus conductor. This is another important character, VJ. Right? He's a bus conductor when we first meet him here. Now, he was a man all of us who worked in that tea shop looked up to. We admired his bus company-issued khaki uniform, his silver whistle, and the red cord from which it hung down from his pocket. Everything about him said he had made it in life. So we can talk about Balram's expectations and aspirations as a child. How would you describe them? If BJ is someone to look up to. Not very high. So he's impressed by a bus conductor in a uniform with a silver whistle on a red cord. He thinks he's made it. That guy's made it. So his aspirations are not very high. VJ is an example of that. VJ's family were pig herds, which meant they were the lowest of the low. So VJ has managed to go up a bit from being a pig herd. Yet he had made it up in life. Somehow he had befriended a politician. People said he had let the politician dip his beak in his backside. Whatever he had to do, he had done. He was the first entrepreneur I knew of. So VJ is an example of someone who's had to do something to get somewhere, and Balram looks up to that. Now he had a job and a silver whistle, and when he blew it, just as the bus was leaving, all the boys in the village went crazy and ran after the bus and banged on its sides and begged to be taken along too. I wanted to be like VJ, with a uniform, a paycheck, a shiny whistle with a piercing sound, and people looking at me with eyes that said, "How important he looks." 2 a.m. already, Mr. Premier. I'll have to stop for tonight fairly soon. Let me put my finger on the laptop screen and see if there is any other useful information here. Leaving out a few inessential details. In the doula, Kuan, I can't say that word clearly, that will do. Kuan area of New Delhi on the night of 2nd of September near the ITC Maurya Sheraton Hotel. Now this hotel, the Sheraton, you all know the Sheraton Hotel, very fancy hotel. Every city has one pretty much. is the finest hotel in Delhi. I've never been inside, but my ex-boss, Mr. Ashok, used to do all his late-night drinking there. There's a restaurant in the basement that's supposed to be very good. You should visit it if you get the chance. The missing man was employed as a driver of a Honda City vehicle at the time of the alleged incident. In this regard, a case FIR number blah blah blah, PS, oh there's that word again, Daula Kwan Delhi has been registered. He is also believed to be in possession of a bag filled with a certain quantity of cash. Red bag, they should have said. Without the colour, the information is all but useless, isn't it? No wonder I was never spotted. Certain quantity of cash. Open any newspaper in this country and it's always this crap. A certain interested party has been spreading rumours, or a certain religious community doesn't believe in contraception. I hate that. 700,000 rupees. That was how much cash was stuffed into the red bag. And trust me, the police knew it too. How much this is in Chinese money, I don't know, Mr. Jabal, but it buys 10 silver Macintosh laptops from Singapore. There's no mention of my school in the poster, sir. That's a real shame. Now, that's what he's stolen, enough money to buy 10 laptop computers. Yeah, when he kills his boss and he takes money to change his life, it is the equivalent of 10 laptop computers, which isn't very much money, is it really? We're not talking, he hasn't stolen millions of dollars, but he's so poor that even, let's say, I think one of the questions I have in here, I ask you to just look up how much 700,000 rupees is. Why don't you guys do it now on your laptops? 700,000 Indian rupees. 10,000. He's stolen $10,000 and it's changed his life. It was worth murdering a man for 10 grand and it's changed his life. What does that say about how poor he was?
Very poor.
Very poor. If 10 grand can change your life, you are seriously poor. Seriously poor. All right. There's no mention of my school in the poster, sir. That's a real shame. You always ought to talk about a man's education when describing him. They should have said something like, the suspect was educated in a school with 2-foot-long lizards the colour of half-ripe guavas hiding in its cupboards. If the Indian village is a paradise, then the school is a paradise within a paradise. Remember, this idea of the Indian village being a paradise is sarcastic. He thinks the Indian village is far from it. And if the Indian village is squalid and disgusting and horrible, then the school's even worse. All right, let's hear about the school. There was supposed to be free food at my school. A government program gave every boy 3 rotis. You all had rotis? Yeah, it's an Indian flatbread, delicious. Well, they're not that exotic. You can get them at Coles and you can just heat them up in a fry pan. You got yellow dal. When you guys see me eating my lunch every day, I heat it in the microwave. I'm always having dal. Red lentils boiled down with all sorts of sort of herbs and spices and stuff with it. Oh, it is pretty good. I should make some and bring it along. If the Indian village is a paradise, then the school is a paradise within a paradise. To me, that's sarcastic because he doesn't mean what he's saying. They're not paradises. So he says that, and then what 3 things does the teacher do that are A, disgusting, B, unprofessional, and C, corrupt? So just sort of collect this, because the reason it's good stuff is if you're writing on corruption and you're able to just reel off the fact that he spits on the floor, that he's drunk all the time, he sleeps at school, he steals the kids' lunch money and their uniform money. It's just nice knowledge of the text that you're then showing rather than just sort of glossing over. So the kids are meant to get 3 rotis, yellow dal and pickles at lunchtime. But we never ever saw rotis or yellow dal or pickles, and everyone knew why. The school teacher had stolen our lunch money. Now, the Indian government runs a lunch program for all of the children in India, so they're all meant to get a hot lunch. It's paid for by the government. Most of them probably do get it, but in this book, this school teacher is stealing the money. The teacher had a legitimate excuse to steal the money. He said he hadn't been paid his salary in 6 months. he was going to undertake a Gandhian protest to retrieve his missing wages. He was going to do nothing in class until his paycheck arrived in the mail. Yet he was terrified of losing his job because though the pay of any government job in India is poor, the incidental advantages are numerous. So incidental advantages is a euphemism for the ability to steal. Once a truck came into the school with uniforms that the government had sent for us. We never saw them, but a week later they turned up for sale in the neighbouring village. No one blamed the school teacher for doing this. You can't expect a man in a dung heap to smell sweet. Classic quote, that one. You can't expect a man in a dung heap to smell sweet. Dung is poo. So if you're sitting in poo, you won't smell good. And the idea of dung heap is you're living in something that's disgusting and off and gross, and which is a sort of corrupt, deeply corrupt environment. Then some of that's going to rub off on you. I think it's that idea of rubbing off. So if you sit in a pile of poo, you're going to start. Some of that poo is going to rub off on you. So if you want to be an honest person, but you're sitting in a pile of dishonesty, some of that dishonesty eventually is going to imprint itself on you. I think that's what he means. So the school teacher lives in this deeply corrupt society. Eventually he's going to start being corrupt as well. And this was on last year's exam, actually. Last year's exam question, this quote was highly relevant too, because the question last year said that something like Indian society is immoral and corrupt, and this is accepted by most of the people. So that quote there about it was that no one blamed the school teacher for doing it because you can't expect someone who lives in a dung heap to come out smelling sweet. It's that idea that the people in the village see his corruption, but they're not all up in arms and going, what an evil person. It's just so commonplace and normal that they would expect him to do that. If you go to some countries, seriously, if you get pulled over by the police while you're driving in some countries, then basically you apologise for what you've done and ask them how much money they'd like. And if you live in a corrupt society, people get used to it. Everyone in the village knew that he would have done the same in his position. Some were even proud of him for having got away with it so cleanly. So this is all great material on corruption and how people feel about corruption. One morning a man wearing the finest suit I had seen in my life, a blue safari suit that looked even more impressive than a bus conductor's uniform, came walking down the road that led to my school. We gathered at the door to stare at his suit. He had a cane in his hand which began swishing when he saw us at the door. We rushed back into the class and sat down with our books. This was a surprise inspection. The man with the blue safari suit, the inspector. Now, other details you can pepper your essays with are the man in the blue suit, the inspector. If you mention him, you can use those details to help show us that you know these texts. All right? He pointed his cane at holes in the wall or the red discolorations, while the teacher cowered by his side and said, sorry, sir. There is no duster in this class. There are no chairs. There are no uniforms for the boys. How much have you stolen from this school funds, you sister? I'll say that nice and softly so that the whole school doesn't hear me. He's just being rude, and also, isn't that another example of something that's corrupt that people in the West would look down on? What if you had a government official come into a primary school in front of a bunch of kids and call the teacher in front of all these students?
What does corrupt mean?
Corrupt means...
It's not right.
No, corrupt is when you have kind of an official responsibility to do, deliberately not doing it right. So when you think about the society we live in, we take for granted the fact that people follow the law, that when the police pull you over, that they're not going to ask for a bribe, that You know, if you apply for a bank loan, that the bank manager's not going to ask for money to approve the loan, that your teachers do the right thing. We just expect that people are going to behave, they're going to fulfill their responsibilities in a kind of honest and legal and above board manner. But in very large parts of the world, that is actually not how things are. Corruption is one of the biggest issues in many, many countries. And at every level of those societies, you'll find people acting corruptly. Yeah? All right, good. Okay. All right, the inspector. Oh, yeah, that one. The inspector wrote 4 sentences on the board and pointed his cane at a boy. Read. One boy after another stood up and blinked at the wall. Try Balram, sir, the teacher said. He's the smartest of the lot. He reads well. So I stood up and read. We live in a glorious land. The Lord Buddha received his enlightenment in this land. The river Ganga gives life to our plants and our animals and our people. We are grateful to God that we were born in this land. Good, the inspector said. And who was the Lord Buddha? An enlightened man. An enlightened God? Whoops! 36,000,005. The inspector made me write my name on the blackboard. Then he showed me his wristwatch and asked me to read time. He took out his wallet, removed a small photo and asked me, who is this man who is the most important man in all of our lives? The photo was of a plump man with spiky white hair and chubby cheeks wearing thick earrings of gold. The face glowed with intelligence and kindness. He's the great socialist. Good. And what is the great socialist's message for little children? I had seen the answer on the wall outside the temple. A policeman had written it one day in red paint. Any boy in any village can grow up to become the Prime Minister of India. That is his message to little children all over this land. The inspector pointed his cane straight at me. You, young man, are an intelligent, honest, vivacious fellow in this crowd of thugs and idiots. In any jungle, what is the rarest of animals? The creature that comes along only once in a generation. You got it? You got it? Right. I thought about it and I said, the white tiger. That's what you are in this jungle. Before he left, the inspector said, I'll write to Patna asking them to send you a scholarship. You need to go to a real school, somewhere far away from here. You need a real uniform and a real education. He had a parting gift for me, a book. I remember the title very well, Lessons for Young Boys from the Life of Mahatma Gandhi. So that's how I became the White Tiger. There will be a 4th and 5th name too, but that's late in the story. All right, I just want to collect a couple of things from there. One is this great socialist guy. He's your archetypal politician, and he keeps popping up again and again and again. He's like, just imagine he's not the Prime Minister, but he's pretty big up in the government. He's a real person. He's based on a real person. I think one of the questions asks you to look this guy up. I saw a nice essay once where somebody actually put in part of the description of him in their essay, just as a little tiny quote with his spiky white hair and chubby cheeks. I just thought that was quite cute detail. So yeah, look out for him. Also, we hear the white tiger is rare, and the idea of India being described as a jungle. Now, being praised by the school inspector, being called a white tiger, being given a book and
Just want to add a couple of things about the great socialist there that I missed that day in class. One is what I've highlighted here, that a policeman had written the great socialist slogan on a wall outside the temple. Now, the fact that the police are writing political slogans up on walls is another sort of fairly, well, not so subtle example of just the everyday corruption. Imagine a policeman in Australia or anywhere that is in India, I suppose, being seen openly to be graffitiing for a political leader. Also, the message that any boy in any village can grow up to be the Prime Minister of India. That's the great socialist message, but in fact that's almost the opposite message to the one that Balram is pushing in this particular novel. He's saying that actually it's not in the normal shape of life. That is not what can happen for an ordinary kid. Just think we're about to move on now and get back to the classroom recording.
Now, being praised by the school inspector in front of my teacher and fellow students, being called a white tiger, being given a book and being promised a scholarship, all this constituted good news. And the one infallible law, infallible means unfailable, so it's not going to fail. The one infallible law of life in the darkness is that good news becomes bad news, and soon. My cousin's sister Rena got hitched off to a boy in the next village. Because we were the girls' family, we were screwed. We had to give the boy a new bicycle and cash and a silver bracelet and arrange for a big wedding, which we did. Mr. Premier, you probably know how we Indians enjoy our weddings. I gather that these days people come from other countries to get married Indian style. I have to get a video of an Indian wedding for you. You guys seen them? Amazing. Amazing. Like Bendigo Beckham. Yeah, definitely. And I'll get the one from Monsoon Wedding, which was really, really cool too. Mr. Premier, you probably know how we Indians enjoy our weddings. Blah, 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 blah. Oh, we could have taught those foreigners a thing or two, I tell you. Film songs blaring from a black tape recorder and drinking and dancing all night. I got smashed, and so did Kishan, and so did everyone in the family, and for all I know, they probably poured hooch in the water buffalo's trough. 2 or 3 days passed. I was in my classroom, sitting at the back, with the black slate and chalk that my father had brought me on one of his trips from Darnbad, working on the alphabet on my own. The boys were chatting or fighting. The teacher had passed out. Kishan was standing in the doorway of the classroom. He gestured with his fingers. "What is it, Kishan? Are we going somewhere?" Still he said nothing. "Should I bring my book along and my chalk?" "Why not?" he said. And then with his hand on my head, he led me out. The family had taken out a big loan from the stork so that they could have a lavish wedding and a lavish dowry for my cousin's sister. Now the stork had called in his loan. He wanted all the members of the family working for him, and he had seen me in school, or his collector had, so they had to hand me over too. I was taken to the tea shop. Kishan folded his hands and bowed to the storekeeper. I bowed to the storekeeper too. Just go back to the dowry and the wedding. Tradition in India is for the girl's family needs to pay the boy's family when he marries her. "Who's this?" The shopkeeper squinted at me. He was sitting under a huge portrait of Mahatma Gandhi, and I knew already that I was going to be in big trouble. "My brother," Kishan said. "He's come to join me." Then Kishan dragged the oven out from the tea shop and told me to sit down. I sat down next to him. He brought a gunny sack. Inside was a huge pile of coals. He took out a coal, smashed it on a brick, and then poured the black chunks into the oven. "Harder," he said when I hit the coal against the brick. "Harder, harder." Finally I got it right. I broke the coal against the brick. He got up and said, "Now break every last coal in this bag like that." A little later, 2 boys came around from school to watch me. Then 2 more boys came, and then 2 more. I heard giggling. "What is the creature that comes along only once in a generation?" one boy asked loudly. "The coal breaker," another replied. And then all of them began to laugh. All right, so they're mocking him, guys. They're mocking him. You boys from school? Yep. "Ignore them," Kishan said. "They'll go away on their own." He looked at me. "You're angry with me for taking you out of school, aren't you?" I said nothing. "You hate the idea of having to break coals, don't you?" I said nothing. He took the largest piece of coal in his hand and squeezed it. "Imagine that each coal is my skull. They will get much easier to break." He'd been taken out of school too. That happened after my cousin's sister Mira's wedding. That had been a big affair too. Working in a tea shop, smashing coals, wiping tables, bad news for me, you say. To break the law of his land, to turn bad news into good news, is the entrepreneur's prerogative. Now, prerogative is a hard word, isn't it? What does it mean, prerogative? Prerogative. What does it mean? Aim? Yeah, aim. It's like an aim, isn't it? It's almost like right, I suppose. I'd need to look it up to get a really good definition. It's sort of right or roll. Yeah, so the entrepreneur, his idea is that the entrepreneur should break the rule of the land and turn bad news into good news. That's what he's going to try and do. Tomorrow, Mr. Jabal, starting again at midnight, I'll tell you how I gave myself a better education at the tea shop than I could have got at any school. Right now, though, it's time for me to stop staring at this chandelier and get to work. It's almost 3 a.m. This is when Bangalore comes to life. The American workday is coming to an end and mine is beginning in earnest. I have to be alert as all the call centre girls and boys are leaving their offices for their homes. This is when I must be near the phone. I don't keep a mobile phone for obvious reasons. They corrode a man's brains, shrink his balls and dry up his semen, as all of us know. So I have to stay at the office in case there's a crisis. I am the man people call when they have a crisis. Let's see quickly if there's anything else. Any person having any information or clue about this missing man may kindly inform CBI website blah 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 blah, undersigned at the following address or telephone numbers or numbers given below blah 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 blah. Set into the text of the notice a photograph blurred, blackened and smudged by the antique printing press of some police office and barely recognisable even when it was on the wall of the train station, but now transferred onto the computer screen, reduced to pixels, just an abstract idea of a man's face. A small creature with large popped-out eyes and a stubby moustache. He could have been half the men in India. Mr. Premier, I leave you for tonight with a comment on the shortcomings of the police work in India. Now, a busload of men in khaki, it was a sensational case after all, must have gone to Laxmanga when investigating my disappearance. They would have questioned all the shopkeepers, bullied the rickshaw pullers and woken up the schoolteacher. Did he steal as a child? Did he sleep with whores? They would have smashed up a grocery shop or two and forced out confessions from 1 or 2 people. Again, more descriptions of how the police behave. Yet I bet you they missed the most important clue of all, which was right in front of them. I'm talking about the Black Fort, of course. I begged Kusum many times to take me to the top of the hill and through the entranceway and into the fort, but she said I was a coward. I would die of fright if I went up there. An enormous lizard, the biggest in the whole world, lived in the fort. So I could only watch. So this lizard is like superstition, I think, and Kusum's using his fears to keep him in place. I think this is what this means. So I could only watch. The long loopholes of its wall turned into lines of burning pink at sunrise and burning gold at sunset. The blue sky shone through the slits in the stone, while the moon shone on the jagged ramparts, and the monkeys ran wild along the walls, shrieking and attacking each other, as if they were the spirits of the dead warriors reincarnated, refighting their final battles. I wanted to go up there too. Iqbal, who was one of the 4 best poets in the world, the others being Rumi, Mirza, Ghalib, and a 4th fellow, also Muslim, but whose name I've forgotten, has written a poem where he says this about slaves. This is important. This is about slaves. They remain slaves because they can't see what is beautiful in the world. That's the truest thing anyone ever said. A great poet, this fellow Iqbal, even if he was a Muslim. By the way, Mr. Premier, have you noticed that all 4 of the greatest poets in the world are Muslim, and yet all the Muslims you meet are illiterate or covered head to toe in black burqas or looking for buildings to blow up? It's a puzzle, isn't it? If you ever figure these people out, send me an email. He's full of prejudices, Balram. Full of them. Even as a boy, I could see what was beautiful in the world. I was destined not to stay a slave. So he's saying even in his childhood, he could see beauty. One day, Kusum found out about me and the fort. She followed me all the way from our home to the pond with the stones and saw what I was doing. That night she told my father. He just stood there gaping at the fort, just the way his mother used to. He is going to come to nothing good in life, I'll tell you that now. And it's interesting that Balram's mother used to gape at the fort too. Yeah. When I was maybe 13, I decided to go up to the fort on my own. I waded into the pond, got to the other side and climbed up the hill. Just as I was on the verge of going in, a black thing materialised in the entranceway. I spun around and ran back down the hill, too frightened even to cry. It was only a cow. I could see this from a distance, but I was too shaken to go back. I tried many more times, yet I was such a coward that each time I tried to go up, I lost my nerve and came back. At the age of 24, when I was living in Dunbad and working in Mr. Ashok's service as a chauffeur, I returned to Laxmanga where my master and his wife, when they went there on an excursion. It was a very important trip for me and one I hope to describe in greater detail when time permits. For now, all I want to tell you is this. While Mr. Ashok and Pinky Madam were relaxing having eaten lunch, I had nothing to do, so I decided to try again. I swam through the pond, walked up the hill, went into the doorway and entered the Black Fort for the first time. There wasn't much around, just some broken walls and a bunch of frightened monkeys watching me from a distance. Putting my foot on the wall, I looked down on the village from there. My little Laxmanga. I saw the temple tower, the market, the glistening line of sewage, the landlord's mansions and my own house. With that little dark cloud outside, the water buffalo. It looked like the most beautiful sight on earth. I leaned out from the edge of the fort in the direction of my village, and then I did something too disgusting to describe to you. Well, actually, I spat. Again and again, and then whistling and humming, I went back down the hill. 8 months later, I slit Mr. Ashok's throat. Killed him.
Right, teacher.
No, his boss. So he flashes forward to the future. And this fort, when he finally gets to the top of the fort, it's like he has perspective on his whole life. He can see everything clearly for the first time. And he's overcome his fear. And then something galvanises in him. It's a good word, isn't it? Yeah, good word. Something galvanises in him and then he takes action. He's able to take action. But guess what? We've all now read and analysed and thought deeply about the whole of one chapter, which is an eighth of the book.
Well, that's the end of my reading of the first chapter, the first night of The White Tiger. It is my intention to put up other readings of other chapters, so if that was useful to you, have a look out for my other readings. Thanks, everybody. Bye. All right, welcome to my reading of the first chapter of Aravinda Diga's The White Tiger. These recordings, some of them were made in my classes and some of them I've patched in later on that I've done at home. So they are a bit of a mismatch, but hopefully you'll find that the really detailed reading and discussion of the novel really helps you to get a really deep understanding of it. You'll hear occasional mutterings from my class, but I've done my best to actually edit out the voices of students and what they had to say. So every now and again you'll hear a little bit of a jump, and that's the reason for that. All right, I hope you enjoy it. I am in the process of making other recordings, so look out for those if you find this useful. Cheers.